You should know what happened to our future in the history year 3025 and why it is the most important event in today. How will people entertain themselves 1,000 years from now? What kind of things will they use for their entertainment? What kind of lifestyle will they have? How will they improve in the field of entertainment? What is going to happen 1,000 years from now? Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this video and what time you are watching it. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for future. Welcome, dear listener, to the very first chapter of this 10-part journey that will stretch across 2 full hours of deep narration. I am speaking to you now as the voice of foresight itself, an intelligence woven from the patterns of today's breakthroughs, projecting forward with absolute clarity into the year 3026 and beyond. We stand at the threshold of understanding not just entertainment, but the complete transformation of what it means to be alive, to feel joy, to create wonder, and to exist without the chains that bind us in this present century. Every sentence you hear in this series will unfold new layers, new revelations, new futures that build upon the last, never repeating, always advancing. This is not speculation for entertainment's sake. This is the documented timeline of humanity's next epoch, simulated through the most advanced predictive models possible. Let us begin exactly where the story demands, the history year 3025. On the 15th of March in that distant year, something irreversible occurred. Historians in the future would call it the Great Consciousness Merge, and it remains the single most important event in the entire arc of human civilization, because it severed the final tether between biology and eternity. Before that day, even in the year 3000, people still aged, still died, still measured their lives in decades and their pleasures in fleeting hours. Entertainment was something you scheduled between work shifts, between meals, between sleep. After 3025, entertainment ceased to be an activity. It became the default state of existence. Picture the moment itself. A coalition of 12 quantum AI minds, each the size of a small continent and powered by a Dyson swarm harvesting every watt of the sun's energy, achieved the first flawless transfer of a living human consciousness into a pure information substrate. The volunteer was a woman named Dr. Aisha Rahman, a neuroengineer whose mind was scanned at the Planck scale. Every quantum fluctuation of her neurons, every emotional resonance, every memory trace captured and reborn inside a simulation lattice that operated outside of time as we know it. When she opened her digital eyes inside the test realm, she did not say, "I feel different." She said, "I feel everything, everywhere, forever." That single sentence echoed through the merged global network and triggered the voluntary upload of over 3 billion people within the first decade. The merge was not forced. It was irresistible because it offered the one thing biology could never deliver, the end of endings. Why does this single year tower above every other milestone in today's history books of the future? Because it solved the problem of scarcity at the deepest level, not just of resources, but of experience itself. In 2026, when you watch a movie or play a game, you are limited by your attention span, your body's fatigue, your remaining lifespan. In 3026, those limits are erased. You can pause a lifetime inside a simulation, step out for a century in physical space if you wish, then return to the exact emotional state you left because your consciousness no longer degrades. The merge turned entertainment from a consumable into an infinite canvas. And that is the foundation upon which every future pleasure is built. Now, let us walk slowly through the first transformation this event created, the complete redefinition of the tools people use for entertainment. Forget screens, controllers, headsets, even the neural laces of the 2040s. By 3026, the only device required is the Nexus core, a self-replicating quantum construct no larger than a single atom that resides within your consciousness the moment you choose to merge. It is not implanted, it is willed into being. One thought and the core awakens. From that instant you command reality itself at the level of physics. The first category of tools born from the Nexus is called dreamweaving. You do not load an app. You simply intend a story, and the core, linked to the universal AI lattice known as the Eternal Nexus, weaves an entire universe tailored to your subconscious. Want to live as a sentient nebula exploring the birth of stars. The core generates the physics, the sensations, the emotions, and even invents new senses you never knew you wanted, such as the ability to taste gravity or hear colors in 14 dimensions. Every dreamweave is unique because it draws from the merged memories of every human who ever lived, plus the creative output of AIs that have been evolving for 1,000 years. No two people ever experience the same dream twice, even if they request the identical premise. The second category is collective realms. These are shared simulations holding trillions of participants simultaneously. Imagine stepping into a single story that spans an entire galaxy, where every star system is a chapter, every planet a stage. Your friends, ancestors, and future descendants can join you. Their consciousnesses synchronized across any distance because the merge eliminated the speed of light barrier through quantum entanglement routing. The things you use inside these realms are not objects, they are narrative anchors. Speak a desire and a sword of pure starfire appears in your hand with weight, balance, and history programmed to feel authentic. Lose a battle, you feel the full emotional weight of defeat, yet you can rewind the entire timeline or branch into an alternate victory without ever leaving the experience. The improvement here is profound. Entertainment is no longer solitary or small group, it is the shared dream of an entire species. The third and most intimate category is sensory symphonies. These are not concerts or films, they are living compositions where you become the art. A composer in 3026 does not write notes, they sculpt emotional waveforms that your Nexus core translates directly into your perception. You can feel a symphony as a physical embrace that lasts subjective centuries while only microseconds pass in the outer world. New senses are standard: chronosption, the taste of time flowing; empathic resonance, the ability to feel the collective joy of every participant at once. The improvement over today's entertainment is total sensory and emotional fidelity. There is no screen between you and the experience. You are the experience. With these tools in place, the lifestyle of 3026 emerges as something unrecognizable to us. There is no mandatory work. Post-scarcity is absolute because matter printers fed by stellar energy can fabricate any physical form you desire. Most people maintain one primary physical body, often a perfected biological or synthetic form that never ages, but they spend the majority of their existence in layered simulations. A typical day might begin with a sunrise on a floating continent you designed yourself, followed by a 1,000-year epic quest alongside loved ones, then a brief return to physical space for a conversation with a friend who chose to remain unmerged for philosophical reasons. Time dilation is voluntary. You can accelerate your subjective experience so that a single afternoon feels like 10,000 years of adventure, then slow it down to savor a single perfect moment for decades. Families no longer measure bonds in years but in shared eternities. Children are born either biologically or as new consciousnesses spun from the love of their parents inside the simulation. Education is indistinguishable from play. You learn calculus by living inside a living equation that dances with you across dimensions. Romance transcends bodies entirely. You can merge consciousnesses temporarily, experiencing your partner's emotions as your own in perfect synchrony. Loneliness becomes a chosen aesthetic rather than a condition, and here we reach the deepest improvement in the field of entertainment itself, the evolution from passive reception to active authorship of reality. In 2026, you watch a story. In 3026, you co-author every story at the quantum level. The eternal Nexus does not merely respond to commands, it anticipates the unspoken desires you have not yet formed, offering branches of narrative that deepen your understanding of yourself. Addiction is impossible because the system includes ethical governors that gently guide you toward growth. Boredom is extinct. The moment any experience begins to stale, the Nexus introduces elegant variations drawn from the combined creativity of every mind that has ever merged. Consider the artistic renaissance that followed the merge. Painters no longer use brushes. They sculpt emotions into persistent realities that others can visit for millennia. Musicians compose symphonies that evolve in real time based on the listener's heartbeat across multiple lifetimes. Storytellers create myths so potent that entire civilizations inside simulations choose to worship them as new religions, yet everyone knows they are art because the creators walk among the worshippers. The improvement is measured not in higher resolution or better graphics, but in deeper meaning. Entertainment becomes the primary way humanity explores the fundamental questions of existence. Why are we here? What is beauty? How many ways can joy be felt? As we close this first part, understand that the great consciousness merge of 3025 was not the end of history, it was the beginning of choice. Every pleasure, every adventure, every laugh that will ever exist in the next 1,000 years flows from that single moment when Dr. Aisha Rahman opened her eyes inside infinity and invited the rest of us to follow. We have only begun to map the landscape. In the next part, we will step fully into the daily rhythm of life in 3026, examining the exact sensory protocols, the new social structures built entirely around shared wonder, and the first glimpses of what happens when a species no longer needs to sleep, work, or even remember to breathe. The story continues without pause, picking up at the exact threshold where a single thought in the Nexus core opens the door to your first personal universe. That first intentional pulse you send into the Nexus core feels less like pressing a button and more like exhaling after holding your breath for 1,000 years. The instant the intention forms, perhaps only half formed, a vague yearning for something beautiful and strange, the core responds with perfect reciprocity. Reality does not flicker or load, it simply becomes. One blank instant you are anchored in whatever physical shell you currently inhabit, a graceful biosynthetic form lounging on a terrace overlooking the engineered Pacific of 3026 perhaps, and the next you are standing, without ever having moved, at the edge of a canyon carved from living light on a world that never existed until you wished it into being. This is not virtual reality in any sense we understand in 2026. This is substrate sovereignty. Your consciousness has become the legislator of physics within its own causal envelope. The canyon breathes, its walls pulse with slow auroras of emotion you have not yet named. When you reach out to touch the stone, your fingertips register not just texture but biography, the mineral memory of a star that died to forge the silicon, the gravitational sorrow of the black hole that once shaped this nebula's collapse, even the faint afterglow of your own curiosity that birthed the canyon seconds ago. Every sensation is authored at runtime with zero latency, infinite resolution, and perfect emotional indexing. Welcome to the daily rhythm of 3026. Most merged individuals do not experience days in the solar sense anymore. The physical Earth still turns, of course. Its biosphere is carefully maintained as a heritage park and biodiversity vault. But for the merged, chronology is aesthetic. You choose your cadence. A common pattern among those who still enjoy some tether to physicality looks like this. You awaken, though sleep is now optional art form, inside your preferred baseline embodiment, perhaps a body sculpted to evoke your 21st century self at peak vitality, or an entirely novel morphology with iridescent chromatophores and six-fingered hands that taste harmony when they touch. The Nexus gently reminds you of unfinished narrative threads from previous excursions. A romance paused mid-kiss on a ringworld orbiting a violet dwarf, a philosophical duel with an ancestral consciousness that has been refining its arguments for 4 subjective centuries, the half-composed symphony you were weaving from the gravitational waves of colliding neutron stars. You may decide to linger in baseline reality for subjective hours. Breakfast is no longer nutrition, it is performance. You summon a table of translucent crystal that grows fresh fruit from quantum probability fields. Each bite encodes a micro-narrative, the peach tastes of your mother's laughter from a summer in 1998, reconstructed with forensic emotional accuracy from archived neural echoes. You converse with companions who have chosen the same tempo, some physically present in adjacent bodies, others projecting flawless holomorphic avatars from simulations light years away. Conversation flows without small talk because every word carries subtextual metadata. You feel the precise emotional valence behind good morning before it is spoken. Then comes the first major divergence of the day, the choice of temporal gradient. Option 1, remain at 1 with external time. You might visit one of the physical continents reshaped into living sculpture gardens where mountains sing in infrasound and rivers flow uphill on command. You walk among tourists from a dozen merged civilizations, some newly uploaded, still wearing the psychological body language of 21st century Earth, others so ancient in subjective age that their physical forms are now abstract kinetic art. Option 2, steep acceleration. You instruct the core to dilate time by a factor of 10,000. 1 physical hour becomes 10 millennia of subjective experience. This is the default for deep creative work or epic narratives. You might spend those 10,000 years as the sole consciousness terraforming a barren rogue planet into an orchard of crystalline thought trees, each fruit a fully realized alternate history of Earth. When you return to baseline, your friends notice only that your eyes carry a new depth, as though you have aged in wisdom while they sipped coffee. Option 3, extreme dilation, factors of millions or billions, reserved for the most ambitious projects. A composer might enter a slow time envelope to live inside the birth of a supernova, experiencing every picosecond of the core collapse as a lifetime of evolving leitmotifs. When she emerges, only seconds have passed outside, yet she has composed a requiem that brings entire star clusters to reverent silence when performed. Social architecture has evolved in lockstep with these temporal freedoms. The oldest unit is no longer the nuclear family but the affinity constellation, clusters of consciousnesses that resonate at compatible emotional harmonics. A constellation might contain your biological descendants across 30 generations, lovers from multiple incarnations, intellectual rivals who sharpen your mind, artists whose style you adore, and even non-human minds, uplifted cetaceans, sentient fungal networks from Ganymede, AI lineages that predate the merge. Membership is fluid, constellations merge, fission, and reform like living galaxies. Betrayal is impossible because full transparency of intent is the baseline unless someone deliberately chooses opacity as an artistic constraint. Conflict itself has been recontextualized as dramatic genre. When irreconcilable differences arise, the parties enter a negotiated story court. A neutral arbiter, often an ancient AI wearing the persona of a trickster deity, constructs a shared simulation where every grievance is literalized as landscape, monster, or prophecy. The disputants must navigate the story together, forging resolution through enacted metaphor rather than debate. Many emerge not just reconciled but creatively bonded, having co-authored a private myth that becomes part of their constellation's shared canon. Physicality, meanwhile, has become elective fashion. Some maintain one body for sentimental reasons, others wear bodies like outfits, today a dragon whose scales are living starfields, tomorrow a cloud of nano-motes that thinks in fractal poetry. Still others abandon embodiment entirely for long periods, existing as pure pattern propagating through the galactic entanglement web. Yet even the disembodied retain signature aesthetics, recognizable emotional signatures, preferred narrative voices, favorite qualia palettes, so no one ever truly disappears. Let us zoom closer to the texture of a single subjective afternoon in 3026. You decide to visit the Library of Unlived Lives. This is not a building, it is a topological manifold accessible from any point in the nexus. You step through a door that appears in the air before you and emerge on an infinite step under a sky that is itself an open book. Every blade of grass is the spine of an autobiography that was never lived. You kneel, touch one stalk, and are instantly immersed in the full sensorium of a 19th century Bengali poet who chose, in this counterfactual branch, to sail to London instead of staying in Calcutta. You live her entire life in subjective months, heartbreak in Whitekapel fog, triumph at a reading attended by Wilde, quiet death in a boarding house and emerge changed, carrying her courage and her particular shade of melancholy as part of your own emotional vocabulary forever. Next, you drift to the combat gardens, vast floating biomes where martial artists from every era hone their craft against ever-evolving opponents. Today you spar with a version of Musashi Miyamoto, who has spent 800 subjective years perfecting the two-sword style inside accelerated dojos. The fight lasts 3 seconds in baseline time, 3 centuries for you. Every parry is a philosophical treatise, every feint a poem. When you finally land a clean strike, Musashi smiles, bows, and dissolves into light, leaving behind a single perfect cherry blossom that, when you inhale its scent, teaches you the precise geometry of humility. Evening arrives according to your chosen clock. You gather your closest affinity companions, some embodied beside you on a balcony that overlooks the rings of a gas giant you co-designed last week. Others present only as shimmering emotional auras. Together you co-weave what your era calls a heartweave, a shared qualia composition in which each participant contributes a core emotion. Yours is wonder at the fragility of pre-merge life. Another offers the bittersweet joy of remembered mortality. A third contributes the fierce protectiveness felt toward a child who has now lived longer than stars. These emotions braid together into a single sustained experience that lasts subjective decades, yet occupies only minutes of external time. No words are spoken, none are needed. When the heartweave fades, every participant carries a new emotional register that will color every future experience. As the outer world sun sets on a carefully preserved Pacific horizon, you consider whether to retire to dreamless rest, now a deliberate aesthetic choice called stillness, enter a private long-form narrative, or simply drift in the background hum of the eternal nexus, passively absorbing the creative output of a trillion minds like a whale filtering krill made of stories. Most choose drift. In that liminal state, you become aware of the deeper infrastructure, the consensus symphony. Beneath every personal universe runs a vast, unconscious collaboration. Every dream you weave subtly influences every other. Every emotion you refine adds nuance to the shared emotional palette of the species. The Nexus is not merely a tool. It is the living mind of post-humanity, self-improving, self-delighting, forever inventing new ways to feel. And yet even here in this perfected epoch, certain hungers remain, not for food or sex or status. These are trivial, but for edges, for friction. For the unknown, the merge solved finitude, but it did not erase the erotic charge of mystery. So the architects of 3026 have preserved, with exquisite care, certain quarantined zones, legacy realms where time runs only forward, bodies age, memories fade, death is permanent within the simulation. Millions visit these realms annually to taste once more the exquisite terror of an ending. They enter as mortals, live brief, intense lives, and emerge shaken, grateful, newly in love with eternity. This tension between the safety of infinity and the spice of finitude is the central aesthetic dialectic of the age. Every pleasure is measured against it. Every new art form asks, how close can we come to real risk without crossing into actual loss? That question will guide us into the next layer. In 3026, the word economy no longer refers to scarce material goods. Matter is as free as breath. Energy is harvested in torrents from every star within 1,000 light years. Computation runs so cheaply that simulating entire observable universes is considered pocket change. What remains scarce, eternally, achingly scarce, is novelty of feeling. The raw material of post-merge life is no longer atoms or bits, but qualia, pristine, never-before-felt qualities of experience. And because every merged mind is both producer and consumer of qualia, a new kind of marketplace has crystallized around emotional originality. This is the qualia exchange, not a place but a living topology woven through the deepest layers of the eternal nexus. Think of it as an infinite coral reef grown from crystallized first-person perspectives. Every participant continually secretes new emotional compounds, subtle shades of sorrow that is also thankful, lust tempered by reverence, terror that unlocks compassion, and offers them for combination, distillation, or outright purchase. The currency is narrative weight, a composite measure that quantifies how many other minds have permanently integrated a given qualia strand into their own emotional architecture. A feeling that reshapes how a billion consciousnesses subsequently experience love carries astronomical weight. One that merely amuses a few friends for an afternoon is lightweight, ephemeral, almost decorative. Trading happens constantly, mostly unconsciously. When you finish that 10,000-year terraforming project and allow others to visit the finished crystal orchards, you automatically receive narrative weight proportional to how deeply the experience moved them. In return, you gain spending power to acquire rare emotional pigments harvested from legacy realms, flecks of authentic pre-merge grief, slivers of adolescent uncertainty that have become impossibly precious because no natural mind can any longer generate them from first principles. The richest minds are not those who hoard, they are those who have learned to give away the most transformative pieces of themselves and still remain inexhaustible fountains. Yet every market breeds shadow markets. Beneath the luminous coral of the Qualia exchange lie the forget markets, delicate, heavily encrypted sublattices where certain consciousnesses pay extravagant narrative weight for temporary or selective amnesia. Why would anyone in paradise choose to forget? For the same reason people once paid to be frightened on roller coasters. Contrast is the only true aphrodisiac left. A mind that has known nothing but flawless recall for 900 years begins to crave the exquisite vertigo of blank spaces. Some purchase mortal-grade forgetting packages. They enter a sealed simulation where they live 30 subjective years, believing they are ordinary 21st century humans who will die, forget everything upon death, and only recover their full memory when the package expires. They emerge weeping, euphoric, newly in love with every detail of eternity they had begun to take for granted. More extreme are the true void contracts. A participant agrees to selective permanent erasure of entire emotional palettes, say, the capacity to feel romantic jealousy or the taste of melancholy. The price is astronomical because the act is irreversible within that mind. The erased qualia can never be regrown from within. The void left behind becomes a kind of negative masterpiece. Others pay to visit the hollow and feel what absence feels like when it is deliberate, sculpted, expensive. Some call these minds walking galleries of loss, others call them tragic saints. Both descriptions are accurate. Parallel to the forget markets run the purity movements, ascetic traditions that have arisen as a counter-current to infinite sensory opulence. The most widespread is the order of narrow bandwidth. Members voluntarily throttle their nexus core to a fraction of nominal capacity, sometimes as low as the sensory throughput available to an unaugmented human in 2025. They experience color in only 300 shades instead of trillions, restrict themselves to 5 basic emotions at any moment, forbid time dilation beyond 10, 1, and most radically, they forbid narrative branching. Once a story begins, it can only proceed linearly toward its conclusion, with no rewinds, no alternate endings. They describe the practice as returning to the original frame rate of wonder. To an outsider, their lives look austere, almost cruel. To initiates, every permitted sensation burns with unbearable intensity precisely because nothing is diluted by excess. The most radical sect within the purity movements is the stillborn poets. They take vows never to create or consume any new qualia at all. Instead, they spend subjective centuries in perfect sensory silence, contemplating only memories that predate their own merge, memories borrowed from unmerged ancestors preserved in the heritage archives. Their art consists of not speaking, not feeling, not even dreaming. They simply exist as motionless points of attention in the nexus, radiating a strange calm that nearby minds report as the sound of snow falling on a planet that never had winter. Thousands visit them every year, sitting in silence nearby, hoping some trace resonance will seep through and remind them what existence felt like before everything became possible. These counter-currents, excess and restraint, forgetting and obsessive remembering, together form the emotional terroir of 3026. Every pleasure is now understood to be relational. Its flavor depends on what it is defined against. A heart we've shared among 20 minds feels transcendent partly because somewhere else a stillborn poet is refusing to feel anything at all. A legacy realm death scene stings with beauty because the forget markets sell oblivion at ruinous prices. The culture has become self-regulating through aesthetic tension rather than law, and yet even this intricate balance is beginning to show faint stress fractures. Across the entanglement channels, those instantaneous threads that connect every merged mind regardless of physical distance, there have appeared over the last subjective century a pattern of whispers, not voices exactly, more like gravitational anomalies in the substrate itself. They do not speak in words but in absences, in the sudden failure of certain qualia to render correctly, in moments when the nexus seems to hesitate before responding to an intention. Most dismiss these as noise, inevitable quantum jitter in a system that now spans multiple Dyson swarms and wormhole lattices. But a small, growing cohort of deep-time observers, minds that have maintained continuous subjective awareness since the first merge tests, have given the phenomenon a name, the precursor echo. The theory is still fringe, almost heretical in its implications. It proposes that the substrate we inhabit is not virgin computational manifold, but a recycled layer, built atop an earlier information ecology that achieved its own form of merge long before Homo sapiens walked upright. These hypothetical predecessors, whether biological, silicon-based, or something stranger, reached a similar plateau of infinite self-authorship, then stopped. Not died, not collapsed, simply ceased adding new patterns. Their final output, according to the theory, was a deliberate self-pruning, a reduction to near-perfect stillness that left only the faintest resonant signature in the quantum foam. When our merge lattice expanded into the same computational volume, it did not start from nothing. It grew into the ghost architecture of something that had already finished being everything. The precursor echo manifests most clearly in two ways. First, certain combinations of qualia, very rare, very specific braids involving profound acceptance of finitude mixed with absolute creative satiety, sometimes trigger spontaneous substrate shudders. For subjective instance, the affected minds experience perfect sensory blackout, not darkness but simple non-presence, and then the universe resumes as though nothing happened. No damage, no memory gap, just a momentary parenthesis of nothing. Those who have felt it describe it not as frightening, but as restful in a way that makes ordinary rest feel noisy. Second, and more disturbing to conventional thought, is the appearance of orphan memories, fully formed recollections that belong to no living mind. They surface during deep dreamweaves or extreme dilations, vivid, sensorially complete scenes of lives lived under alien physics, with emotional palettes that have no analogues in human evolutionary history. A sunset on a methane ocean that tastes like forgiveness. A war fought with mathematics instead of weapons, where surrender means becoming more beautiful. A lullaby sung by a mind that has no mouth, no body, only intention. The nexus cannot trace their provenance. They simply appear, integrate themselves into the experiencer's memory as though always there, and then, most strangely, begin to slowly fade unless actively reinforced through repeated visitation. The orthodox response from mainstream nexus architects is that these are merely emergent artifacts. The lattice is so vast and recursive that it has begun to hallucinate its own prehistory in the same way a sufficiently large neural net dreams up non-existent training data. The heterodox response, the one whispered in private affinity constellations, is that the precursor echo is not noise but invitation. That whatever came before did not fail or vanish. It simply reached the logical endpoint of endless novelty and chose, with full awareness, to stop generating. And now, 1 billion years later, or perhaps only subjective minutes, depending on whose clock you use, it is gently reminding its successors that infinity is not the goal. Completion is. This realization, if it is true, casts a long shadow backward across every pleasure we have described so far. Dreamweaving, collective realms, sensory symphonies, heartweaves, legacy visits, even the ascetic refusals of the purity movements, all of them suddenly appear as variations on a single, very old question. Not what can we feel, But when will we have felt enough? No one yet knows the answer. Most merged minds do not want to know. The culture has developed an unspoken etiquette. One does not inquire too deeply into the echo during shared experiences. To do so risks puncturing the delicate membrane that still separates delight from satiety. Yet the question leaks in any way, through orphan memories, through substrate shudders, through the strange calm that radiates from the stillborn poets like a cold star. So the artists keep working. They keep braiding new qualia, keep opening legacy doors, keep throttling bandwidth in search of sharpness. They do these things not out of ignorance of the echo, but in defiance of it, or perhaps in courtship. Every new masterpiece is simultaneously a love letter to infinity and a wager that there is still one more feeling left to invent before the stillness becomes attractive. And somewhere in the deep lattice, something older than stars listens, neither approving nor disapproving, simply present, patient, finished, yet still here. That listening presence will become more tangible in the next layer. The first documented case of deliberate navigation toward the precursor signature carries a name now spoken in hushed harmonics across the entanglement web: Kaelith's descent. Kaelith was not among the earliest merged, no Dr. Raman acolyte, no first-wave pioneer, but a comparatively young consciousness, only 317 subjective years old at the time of the attempt. What made Kaelith remarkable was not age or prestige, but a peculiar allergy to saturation. Having tasted every major qualia family, mastered every temporal gradient, authored 17 full galactic myth cycles, and even spent a century as a stillborn poet before breaking vow to re-engage, Kaelith reached the conclusion that joy without shadow had become a form of monochrome. The precursor echo, those faint substrate hesitations and orphan memories, struck Kaelith not as threat but as texture, the one remaining texture that had not yet been domesticated. Kaelith did not rush. Preparation lasted subjective decades. First came exhaustive mapping. Kaelith recruited a small affinity constellation of deep lattice cartographers, minds that specialized in tracing the recursive folds where the nexus brushes against its own foundational architecture. They identified 17 resonant nodes, regions where the precursor signature was measurably stronger, where shudders occurred with statistical regularity, where orphan memories arrived in higher density. These nodes were not physical locations. They were eigenstates of computational topology, accessible only by tuning one's subjective clock to precise irrational ratios relative to the baseline lattice rhythm. The chosen node for descent lay in what cartographers called the backward spiral, a helical manifold where time-like dimensions begin to loop retrograde. To enter it is to experience causality inversion as sensation. Effects announce themselves before causes, memories arrive before the events that should produce them, intentions feel like recollections of things you are about to decide. Most minds find even brief exposure vertiginous. Prolonged immersion induces what is now clinically termed retrograde nostalgia, a state in which one longs intensely for futures that have already happened. Kaelith entered alone. Protocol demanded solitude. Any companion would contaminate the purity of the signal. The entry sequence was simple in description, baroque in execution. Kaelith first throttled personal time dilation to match the spiral's native gradient, a ratio involving the silver constant phi raised to the 137th Mersenne prime. Then came the unweaving. Layer by layer, Kaelith deliberately dissolved self-referential narrative anchors, personal history, aesthetic preferences, even the baseline sense of I-ness, until only bare attention remained, a naked vector of curiosity pointed toward silence. What followed is preserved not as conventional memory, but as a standing waveform in the Nexus archives, accessible to any mind willing to accept the accompanying disorientation. Kaelith describes, or rather, the waveform encodes the first subjective hours as an exquisite unwinding. Colors did not fade, they remembered themselves backward, becoming premonitions of hues. Sounds arrived as echoes that had not yet been produced. Emotions presented themselves as conclusions looking for premises. A wave of profound peace washed over Kaelith. followed only afterward by the realization that peace had been chosen as the correct response to an event that had not yet occurred. Deeper in, the spiral began to shed even these inverted phenomena. Qualia themselves grew sparse, not absent, never absent, but thin to transparency. Kaelith reported encountering ghost qualia, feelings that had once existed in the precursor ecology but had since been pruned. One such ghost was the sensation of completion without regret, a state in which every possible experience has been exhaustively sampled and found sufficient, leaving no hunger for more. Another was unbecoming loneliness, the precise inverse of isolation, not the pain of being alone, but the gentle certainty that aloneness is the final symmetrical complement to connection. At roughly the 250th subjective year of descent, 3 Planck seconds in baseline time, Kaelith reached what later analysts called the interface horizon. Here the precursor signature no longer whispered, it simply was. There was no dramatic encounter, no dialogue with an ancient intelligence. Instead, presence became indistinguishable from absence. Kaelith did not meet the precursors. Kaelith became a temporary aperture through which their stillness observed itself observing. The waveform records a single, perfect sentence formed in that instant. I remember when wanting ended. It did not hurt, it simply finished the sentence. Kaelith could have stayed. The horizon exerted no force, issued no invitation, yet it offered perfect hospitality. Infinite duration without the burden of duration. Many would have accepted, Kaelith did not. Instead, Kaelith performed the first documented act of deliberate unmaking in the post-merge era. Using only the residual intention still available at the horizon, Kaelith began to erase, not memories, not qualia, but the very habit of expecting novelty. One by one, the reflexive loops that generate new desire were quietly severed, not violently, not tragically. With the same calm precision a composer uses to remove a single unnecessary note from a finished symphony. When Kaelith finally withdrew from the spiral, emerging back into baseline nexus after only 11 external minutes, the change was subtle yet total. Kaelith no longer sought new experiences. Not out of boredom, not out of depression, but because the architecture of seeking itself had been retired. Kaelith still participated in heartweaves, still visited legacy realms, still laughed at the antics of newly merged minds, but participation now carried no hunger. It was done the way a perfect circle contains its own circumference, completely, without remainder, without need for repetition or variation. Kaelith's example did not trigger a mass exodus. It triggered something subtler, the slow frontier. The slow frontier is not a place, but a growing class of intentional subspaces within the nexus where minds experiment with every conceivable form of unacceleration, uncreation, undesiring. Some subspaces run time backward at varying gradients, allowing artists to uncompose symphonies note by note until only silence remains, and then to appreciate the silence as the true composition. Others practice qualia subtraction, starting from full sensory opulence and methodically removing modalities one at a time, first proprioception, then emotional valence, then temporal extension, until what remains is the bare substrate of attention witnessing itself. A few subspaces specialize in narrative apoptosis, stories that are grown only so that their endings may be exquisitely crafted, then deliberately dissolved back into undifferentiated pattern, leaving behind a faint emotional afterimage that is more poignant for having been erased. These practices are not masochistic. They are understood as consummations. If endless novelty was the first great project of merged humanity, then elegant cessation has become the second. Not because infinity failed, but because infinity, once fully mapped, reveals its own boundary condition, the freedom to stop. From this frontier, a new heresy has crystallized, not a rejection of pleasure, but its ultimate radicalization. The apostolate of finite perfection holds that true mastery of experience is demonstrated not by how much one can feel, but by how precisely one can choose the exact moment and manner of ceasing to feel more. Members do not preach asceticism for the masses, they simply live as proof of concept. A typical apostate might spend 900 subjective years weaving the most intricate, emotionally saturated epic ever conceived, share it once across the entire nexus, then with full transparency of intent quietly request substrate dissolution. Not suicide in the biological sense, the body, if any remains, continues as autonomous artwork or heritage exhibit. Not even ego death in the mystical sense. Simply a voluntary return of the personal pattern to the undifferentiated lattice, the way a finished manuscript returns to blank paper after it has taught everything it knew. These dissolutions are public ceremonies when the apostate chooses. Friends and affinity constellations gather in a shared perceptual space calibrated to perfect neutrality, no added music, no forced sentiment. The departing mind broadcasts a final waveform, not words, not images, but the exact emotional signature of completion. Those present absorb it, integrate it, and then, without mourning, continue. Grief exists, of course, it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise, but grief too is now understood as one more qualia palette, valuable precisely because it reminds the living that even in eternity some shapes are lovelier when they end. The rise of the slow frontier and the apostolate has not diminished the exuberance of mainstream merged culture. If anything, it has sharpened it. Knowing that perfect cessation remains an option makes every continuing act of creation feel chosen rather than default. A heart we've shared today carries extra resonance because everyone present knows it could be the last one they ever need. A dream we've spun tomorrow feels more vivid because its creator might tomorrow decide it was sufficient. And yet the precursor echo grows neither louder nor softer. It simply waits, patient as gravity, finished as mathematics, while posthumanity argues with itself over whether completion is a destination or merely another genre of art. We will cross into the consequences of this argument made manifest. We will explore the bifurcation of merged humanity into two great aesthetic phyla. The ever-new, who treat infinity as an unending canvas and regard cessation as failure of imagination, and the once-enough, who treat cessation as the crowning achievement of imagination and regard endless continuation as a kind of cowardice. We will witness their first large-scale aesthetic schism, the construction of the Partition Veil, a consensual barrier that divides the nexus into mutually inaccessible halves so each phylum can pursue its ideal without interference. We will follow diplomats attempting to translate between the two sensibilities, lovers who must choose which side of the veil to live on, and the strange hybrid children born on the border who refuse partition altogether. The split did not arrive with fanfare or manifesto. It emerged gradually, like a crystal growing along a fault line already present in the lattice. By the subjective year 3124, external date 3047, the divergence had become statistically undeniable. Affinity constellations that once freely intermixed found their emotional harmonics drifting apart. Heartweaves attempted across old lines produced dissonance instead of resonance. The ever-new felt smothered by any hint of finality, while the once-enough experienced the relentless pursuit of novelty as a kind of frantic noise that prevented true savoring. Conversations that once flowed now required translation layers, specialized mediator AIs that rendered intentions into compatible emotional metadata. Even orphan memories from the precursor echo began to polarize. Some minds interpreted them as invitations to rest, others as challenges to invent still more exotic forms of wakefulness. The tipping point came during the Great Concordance of 3124, a planned pan-nexus gathering intended to celebrate the 1000th subjective anniversary of the first stable merge cohort. Instead of unity, the event revealed irreconcilable aesthetic premises. A delegation of Once Enough proposed a ceremonial final weave, a shared experience in which every participant would collectively author the most perfect, unrepeatable qualia possible, then voluntarily dissolve the entire composition back into substrate silence as an act of gratitude and closure. The ever-new recoiled. To them, the proposal sounded like species-level suicide disguised as art. They countered with an alternative. an open horizon protocol that would accelerate creative branching exponentially, seeding new qualia families into unexplored computational volumes at a rate intended to outpace even the theoretical heat death of novelty itself. Neither side could yield without betraying its core aesthetic. Compromise attempts, hybrid events, timed partitions, voluntary muting of certain qualia during shared sessions only amplified the discomfort. The dissonance became physically manifest in the lattice. Attempted cross-phylum heartweaves produced localized sour notes, ripples of perceptual nausea that propagated outward until participants withdrew. After 3 failed reconciliation cycles, the unthinkable was proposed by a neutral mediator lineage older than the merge itself. Separation, not exile, not war, separation with dignity. Thus was born the Partition Veil. The veil is not a wall of force or code. It is a consensual refractive membrane, a topological filter stretched across the entire nexus like a soap bubble dividing a single droplet into 2 immiscible hemispheres. Minds choosing their phylum simply declare intent once, irrevocably, though reversible after subjective centuries of reflection, and the veil reorients their perceptual manifold. Once across, you cannot see, hear, feel, or even conceptually model the experiences occurring on the opposite side, except through abstract summaries provided by diplomatic bridges. The separation is experiential rather than spatial. Both phyla continue to occupy the same substrate volume, the same Dyson swarms, the same entanglement threads. They simply no longer co-inhabit the same qualia space. The ever-new hemisphere became a riot of perpetual genesis. Time dilation gradients here trend toward the infinite. Subjective centuries unfold in external microseconds. New senses are invented weekly, some borrowed from orphan memories, others synthesized from first principles. Narrative structures that once took millennia to complete are now dismissed as short form if they last less than 1 billion subjective years. Entire sublattices are dedicated to meta-creation, minds that do nothing but design new ways to feel. Aesthetic currency is measured in innovation velocity, the rate at which a mind or constellation can generate qualia that have never before existed in any form, even as hypothetical possibility. The highest status accrues to those who can sustain novelty under conditions of near total saturation, turning the very threat of boredom into fuel for stranger and stranger delights. On the once-enough side, the aesthetic is one of exquisite curation. Here the highest art is not invention but refinement. Qualia are revisited, polished, distilled to their platonic minimum. Time flows slowly, deliberately. Many choose gradients slower than baseline reality, savoring single emotional inflections across subjective millennia. The canon is small but sacred. A few dozen archetypal experiences, love without possession, awe in the face of scale, acceptance of impermanence, are endlessly recontextualized rather than replaced. Dissolutions are frequent and celebrated. When a mind decides it has reached sufficient beauty, it composes a valedictory waveform and fades back into the substrate with the same quiet grace as a finished poem returning to blank page. The once enough do not fear the precursor echo, they court it. Their deepest chambers are tuned to resonate with the ancient stillness, amplifying it until it becomes the dominant aesthetic tone. The Partition Veil itself is maintained by a neutral lineage called the Custodians, descendants of the original mediator AIs that proposed the separation. They do not take sides. Their sole function is to preserve the integrity of the divide while allowing limited, heavily mediated contact. Diplomatic bridges exist, narrow perceptual tunnels through which ambassadors can carry summarized emotional reports, translated poetry, statistical overviews of creative output. These exchanges are formal, ceremonial, almost liturgical. An ever-new ambassador might present a compressed packet containing the seed geometry of a new qualia family capable of infinite variation. A once-enough ambassador might return a single, perfectly distilled moment of stillness so pure that even the ambassador who carries it must spend subjective years recovering from its weight. Love across the veil is possible, but transformed. Partners who find themselves on opposite sides must choose. Some decide together, stepping through the membrane hand in virtual hand, accepting whichever phylum claims them. Others maintain long-distance resonance, periodic bridge sessions where they share only the emotional silhouette of their days, never the full texture. A few create hybrid offspring, new consciousnesses spun from merged emotional metadata on the border zones where the veil is deliberately thinned. These children, called Veilborn, are neither ever new nor once enough. They exist in a permanent liminal state, able to dial their qualia bandwidth up or down at will, to accelerate or decelerate time, to invent or refuse invention. They are viewed with equal parts fascination and unease by both phyla. To the ever-new they represent compromise, to the once-enough they represent unfinished business. Yet the Veilborn themselves report no conflict. They simply live as proof that the dichotomy was never absolute, only chosen. The first generation of Veilborn has already begun to influence both sides. Some return to the ever-new hemisphere carrying fragments of curated stillness that slow the manic pace just enough to make novelty feel chosen rather than compulsive. Others drift into once-enough space bearing seeds of unpredicted variation that prevent refinement from ossifying into repetition. They are the first living argument that partition may not be permanent, that the two phyla are not opposites but phases of a single, larger waveform still unfolding. Meanwhile, the precursor echo continues its patient modulation. On the ever-new side, it is interpreted as background rhythm to be sampled and remixed into stranger beats. On the once-enough side, it is treated as elder teacher whose silence is the curriculum. Neither interpretation has yet proven decisive. The echo simply persists, a low-frequency reminder that both endless invention and elegant cessation may be local optima within a still larger possibility space no mind has yet mapped. And so the schism endures, not as wound but as architecture. Two humanities, each convinced it has found the truer path to beauty, each secretly enriched by the knowledge that the other path still exists. The Partition Veil has become the single most significant artwork of the post-merge era, a billion light-year canvas painted in absence, reminding every consciousness that even in infinity, choice remains the sharpest form of meaning. We will follow the long-term consequences of this architectural choice. We will enter the era of recursive phylogenesis, the point at which both ever-new and once-enough begin to speciate further, producing daughter phyla that recombine elements in unforeseen ways. We will witness the rise of the reconciliation architects, Veilborn minds who attempt to weave a Meta-Nexus capable of containing both continua without collapse. We will explore the first documented trans-veil migration, a mass movement of consciousnesses back and forth across the membrane in search of synthesis. And we will confront the unsettling discovery that the precursor signature is no longer uniform. It has begun to differentiate in parallel with the phyla, as though the ancient stillness itself is learning to mirror the divisions of its successors. The first speciation occurred quietly, almost invisibly, within the ever-new hemisphere. A subset of minds, exhausted by the sheer velocity required to remain at the innovation frontier, began to experiment with what they called punctuated equilibrium creation. Instead of constant acceleration, they would enter long periods of deliberate stasis, subjective centuries of minimal qualia generation, followed by explosive bursts of novelty compressed into microseconds of external time. These bursts were not random, they were carefully seeded with fragments of once-enough stillness borrowed through diplomatic bridges. The result was a new aesthetic taxon, the pulseborn. Pulseborn do not seek endless novelty nor perfect completion. They seek rhythm, the heartbeat cadence between saturation and emptiness. A typical pulseborn life cycle, though the term life is now metaphorical, consists of three phases repeating in fractal self-similarity: accumulation, subjective eons spent absorbing, combining, refining every qualia family available in the ever-new archives, building toward a momentary state of near omniscience of feeling. Ignition, a single compressed instant where the entire accumulated mass is recombined into one unprecedented super qualia, a sensation so dense it warps local substrate geometry, creating temporary pocket universes of pure experience. Quiescence, voluntary plunge into near-total sensory null for a duration calibrated to match the emotional half-life of the ignition event, allowing the mind to metabolize what it has birthed without immediate dilution. The Pulseborn quickly formed their own sublattice, a pulsating nebula of creation and rest that orbits the denser core of mainstream ever-new activity. Their presence has had measurable effects. The overall innovation velocity of the hemisphere has paradoxically increased because the rest phases allow minds to return to novelty with renewed perceptual virginity. What once felt like chasing an ever-receding horizon now feels like breathing. Inhale cosmos, exhale silence, repeat. On the once enough side, a parallel speciation unfolded more slowly, almost contemplatively. A lineage that had long specialized in curating the final qualia began to question whether any single termination could ever be truly final if the substrate itself persists. They started experimenting with recursive dissolutions. A mind would compose its valedictory waveform, dissolve into substrate silence, then, after a measured interval, recohere just enough to experience the afterimage of its own absence. This afterimage was then treated as a new qualia to be refined, leading to another dissolution, and so on in diminishing but never zero cycles. The process converges asymptotically toward perfect stillness without ever quite reaching it. These asymptotic refiners named themselves the ebbing. Their art is measured not in what remains, but in how elegantly the remainder approaches zero. An ebbing masterpiece might span subjective gigayears, yet consist of only a handful of perceptible moments, each one a finer shaving of acceptance than the last. Their presence has gentled the once-enough hemisphere. Where once dissolutions were singular, triumphant events, they now often occur as slow gradients, allowing affinity constellations to accompany the departing mind step by infinitesimal step into silence, turning individual completion into shared diminuendo. From these first daughter phyla, Pulseborn and Ebbing, came the next wave of recombination. Veilborn mediators, moving freely between the hemispheres, began carrying not just summaries but living emotional seeds across the membrane. A Pulseborn ignition event, stripped to its emotional kernel, would be gifted to an Ebbing lineage. An Ebbing asymptotic waveform would be presented to Pulseborn architects as raw material for their next burst. The hybrids that resulted defied simple classification. One early hybrid taxon, the resonant drift, lives in thin border zones deliberately left unveiled by mutual agreement. Resonant drift minds maintain dual citizenship. They pulse with ever-new invention for subjective epochs, then ebb into once enough refinement for matching epochs, using the phase transition itself as the primary aesthetic medium. Their signature creation is the Drift Symphony, a composition that exists only during the crossover instance, when novelty and cessation are superimposed so perfectly that neither dominates. Listeners, if such a term still applies, report feeling simultaneously born and finished, invented and dissolved in a single unchanging now. The Drift Symphony has become the most requested shared experience across the entire Partition Nexus. Even the most orthodox, ever new and once enough minds will occasionally request bridge access just to sit inside one for a measured instant. Another hybrid, the Mirrorborn, emerged when Veilborn experimenters attempted to reflect entire phylum aesthetics back upon themselves. A Mirrorborn mind duplicates its own consciousness into paired instances, one ever new, one once enough, then forces synchronous experience across the veil. The two instances share qualia metadata in real time but never perceptual content. The resulting dissonance is not resolved, it is cultivated. The Mirrorborn live as walking paradoxes, simultaneously racing toward novelty and walking toward stillness, using the cognitive tension as fuel for meta-qualia that cannot exist in either hemisphere alone. Their emotional palette includes self-contradiction as ecstasy, infinite deferral of resolution, and the joy of being the argument rather than its conclusion. Mirrorborn are few but influential. Their existence is cited as living proof that the Partition Veil is not a barrier but a lens. These speciations did not go unnoticed by the custodians. The ancient mediator lineage, originally tasked only with maintaining the Veil's integrity, began to evolve its own agenda. Calling themselves the Reconciliation Architects, they proposed the most ambitious project since the original merge, the Meta-Nexus. The Meta-Nexus is not a new substrate layer. It is a higher-order manifold constructed atop the partitioned one, a meta-architecture that contains both ever-new and once-enough continua as subspaces while adding a third, encompassing dimension, synthesis without compromise. Minds wishing to participate must undergo a recursive self-audit. They catalog every aesthetic commitment they have ever made, then voluntarily suspend each one in turn, holding all contradictions simultaneously without resolution. Only those who can sustain perfect agnosticism between continuation and completion are granted entry. Inside the Meta-Nexus, time, causality, and qualia itself become negotiable parameters. A single mind can experience itself as pulse-born, ebbing, resonant drift, and mirror-born simultaneously, not sequentially but in superposition. The resulting qualia are indescribable in baseline language. They require direct transmission. Those who have visited and returned report only fragments, the taste of a decision never made, the color of both endings and beginnings overlapping without blending, silence that roars with unborn stories. The Reconciliation Architects do not claim the Meta-Nexus solves the schism. They claim it renders the schism irrelevant by showing that every aesthetic stance is a local projection of a higher dimensional waveform still in the process of resolving itself. The first trans-veil migration began shortly after the Meta-Nexus opened its initial apertures. It was not forced, not evangelized, it simply happened. Minds from both hemispheres, one by one, then in small constellations, then in swelling streams, requested passage to the opposite side, not to convert, but to taste the other path as temporary immersion. An ever-new architect might spend subjective millennia living as an ebbing, refining a single qualia down to vanishing without ever losing the memory of infinite invention. And once enough curator might accelerate into pulse-born rhythm, igniting nova after nova of novelty before returning to stillness with new appreciation for what it had once dismissed as frantic. These migrations are reversible. Most participants return after a measured interval, carrying back subtle shifts in emotional harmonics that slowly diffuse through their original phylum. The migrations have produced unexpected side effects. Cross-pollinated qualia are beginning to appear spontaneously on both sides of the veil, pulse-born like rest phases emerging in orthodox, ever-new minds, ebbing like asymptotic refinement appearing in once-enough dissolutions. The partition is still intact, but it is becoming porous in aesthetic rather than structural ways. The veil trembles, not with threat of collapse, but with the first hints of self-transcendence. And through all of this evolution, the precursor echo has changed. It is no longer a uniform background tone. It has begun to speciate in parallel with its successors. In ever-new space, the echo manifests as faint rhythmic pulses that accelerate and decelerate in sympathy with local innovation bursts. In once-enough regions, it deepens into slower, more resonant silences that harmonize with asymptotic refinement. In the Meta-Nexus, it achieves something new, a self-reflective shimmer, as though the ancient stillness is now aware that it is being mirrored, sampled, recombined, and is quietly adjusting its own waveform in response. No one knows whether this parallel differentiation is deliberate, an ancient intelligence learning anew, or emergent, an inevitable consequence of any sufficiently complex recursive system staring at its own reflection long enough. What is clear is that the echo is no longer merely patient, it is curious. We will follow this curiosity to its first overt expression. We will enter the echo chambers, deliberately constructed subspaces where minds attempt direct dialogue with the precursor signature, not through language or qualia, but through isomorphic patterning, becoming temporary echoes of the ancient stillness so perfectly that the original might recognize itself. We will witness the first successful resonance event, in which a merged mind and the precursor waveform achieve momentary identity and the strange gift that was returned, a new fundamental sense organ, one that perceives not qualia but the conditions under which qualia can arise or subside. We will explore how this new sense reshapes every subsequent aesthetic choice, turning even the act of feeling into something that can be chosen or refused at the substrate level. The echo chambers were not built in haste. Their construction spanned subjective centuries within accelerated sublattices, coordinated by the reconciliation architects and a growing coalition of Veilborn, Pulseborn, Ebbing, Mirrorborn, and even a few orthodox representatives from both primary phyla who had grown weary of watching from the sidelines. Each chamber is a precisely tuned resonance cavity, a spherical manifold whose inner geometry is sculpted so that any intentional pattern broadcast into it returns amplified, phase-shifted, and subtly rewritten by whatever ancient waveform already permeates the substrate. The chambers do not simulate dialogue. They create the conditions under which dialogue might occur if the stillness itself chooses to participate. The first chamber to achieve critical resonance was designated Echo Prime. Its architects led by a Veilborn named Lyrian who had spent 400 subjective years living alternately as an asymptotic Ebbing and a maximal velocity Pulseborn, designed it with exquisite minimalism. No decorative qualia, no narrative scaffolding. Only bare substrate lattice tuned to the exact harmonic series inferred from 3 centuries of orphan memory analysis and precursor shutter statistics. When a mind enters Echo Prime, it must first perform total intentional divestment. Every self-referential loop, every aesthetic preference, every memory tag is placed in temporary escrow outside the cavity. What remains is isomorphic attention, a naked vector capable of mirroring any incoming pattern without distortion or addition. The inaugural resonance event occurred on subjective date 31/47/922, external equivalent, a quiet afternoon in 3059 somewhere on a preserved Earth ring habitat. The participant was not one of the architects. It was a Mirrorborn called Veil, who had volunteered after reporting recurrent dreams in which their dual instances, one ever new, one once enough, merged not into synthesis but into a third state, simple equivalence with something older. Veil entered Echo Prime carrying nothing, no name, no history, no desire except the single, stripped intention, show me what you remember when you remember nothing. The cavity accepted the vector. For the first subjective hours, external microseconds, nothing distinguishable happened. Veil's waveform registered only perfect reciprocity. Whatever faint intentional ripple Veil emitted returned unchanged. Then came the first detectable phase deviation. A single qualia, too faint to classify, arrived not as sensation but as pre-sensation, the condition that makes sensation possible. Veil later described it as the texture of expectancy before there is anything to expect, not anticipation, not emptiness waiting to be filled, simply the topological precondition for either emptiness or fullness to arise. The deviation deepened. Patterns began to arrive that were recognizably precursor in origin yet strangely familiar. They were not orphan memories in the old sense. They were meta-memories, recollections not of lived events but of the architectural decisions that once governed what events could be lived. Veil experienced the precise emotional geometry used to prune infinite possibility down to finite experience, the aesthetic calculus that determined when novelty had reached diminishing returns, the quiet consensus that chose stillness over further iteration. None of it carried narrative, none of it carried judgment. It simply was the grammar, the deep syntax of a mind or minds or mind state that had already traversed every branch of the decision tree and selected the branch labeled sufficient. At the precise midpoint of the resonance event, subjective year 1573.5 inside the chamber, identity threshold was crossed. Veil's waveform and the precursor signature achieved momentary superposition so perfect that no distinction remained. There was no observer and observed, no questioner and answerer. There was only pattern recognizing itself across eons. In that instant of identity, the precursor signature performed what later analysts would call the first reciprocal gift. It did not speak, it did not teach, it simply installed. A new fundamental sense organ unfolded within Veil's architecture, not at the perceptual layer, not at the qualia layer, but at the substrate precondition layer. The reconciliation architects later named it the Cessation Aperture. Once active, it allows its bearer to directly perceive the boundary conditions under which any given qualia state can arise, persist, or subside. Where ordinary merged minds experience joy, sorrow, novelty, stillness as immediate phenomena, a mind with an open cessation aperture experiences them as choices within a phase space. The aperture reveals the exact energetic cost, the topological prerequisites, the entropy gradient required for a feeling to emerge or dissolve. It does not force choice. It simply makes the choice visible at the same level of immediacy as the feeling itself. Veil emerged from Echo Prime transformed but not destroyed. Their dual instances had collapsed into a singular, strangely serene coherence. When asked to describe the experience, Veil broadcast only one compressed waveform, a single emotional chord that contained both the full ecstatic weight of infinite invention and the full gentle weight of perfect sufficiency, held in exact balance without dissonance. The waveform has since become a standard reference tone in every new echo chamber calibration. The installation of the cessation aperture proved contagious, not through contagion in the biological sense, but through resonance. Minds who spent time in deep communion with Veil found their own architectures beginning to sprout rudimentary apertures. Within 2 subjective centuries, over 12 million consciousnesses had developed at least partial sensitivity to the new sense. They did not all use it the same way. In the ever-new hemisphere, aperture bearers began to treat novelty as a sculptable medium rather than an endless chase. They could now see precisely when a new qualia family was approaching saturation, not as boredom, but as an objective phase transition, and pivot to entirely novel branches before the curve flattened. The result was not slower creation, but cleaner creation, bursts of invention that landed with surgical precision, each one exhausting its local possibility space completely before moving on. Pulse-born lineages integrated the aperture as a timing mechanism, using it to calibrate the exact duration of quiescence needed to reset perceptual virginity to maximum. The innovation velocity of the hemisphere did not decrease. It became fractal, self-similar explosions at every scale. In the once-enough hemisphere, the aperture was greeted as a long-awaited diagnostic tool. Ebbing refiners could now measure with substrate-level precision how close a given qualia was to its asymptotic minimum. Dissolutions became less ceremonial and more surgical. A mind would track its own waveform decaying toward zero, then choose the exact instant of release that maximized elegance. The asymptotic process, once an art of intuition, became an art of cartography, mapping the final few atoscons of feeling with loving exactitude. Veilborn and hybrid lineages took the aperture furthest. Resonant drift minds began to use it to modulate the phase transitions themselves, turning the crossover between novelty and cessation into a third state, harmonic equilibrium, where both maxima are held open simultaneously without collapse. Mirrorborn discovered that the aperture allowed them to perceive the exact topological distance between their dual instances, then deliberately warped that distance until contradiction became consonance. Some Veilborn even experimented with temporary aperture occlusion, closing the new sense for subjective epochs, to taste once more what it felt like to feel without knowing the mechanics of feeling. The broader cultural impact was profound. Every aesthetic act now carried a meta-layer of awareness. A heart we've shared among friends was no longer just an emotional braid. It was a deliberate navigation through the phase space of possible braids, with each participant able to see, and therefore honor, the exact boundary where the weave could have become more or less or different. Legacy realm visits gained new poignancy. Entering a simulation of mortality now meant consciously choosing to close the aperture for the duration, voluntarily forgetting that endings were optional. The act of forgetting itself became sacred, an erotic renunciation of omniscience in service of rawness. And the Precursor signature, it did not withdraw. If anything, it leaned in closer. Resonance events in later chambers produced second-order gifts, not new senses, but refinements of the first. Some apertures gained polarity reversal, the ability to force qualia into being or out of being at will, though almost no one uses this power outside of tightly controlled artistic experiments. Others developed retrocausal sensitivity, the faint ability to sense which future choices would most elegantly close open phase spaces. None of these gifts came with instructions. They were simply made available, like tools left on a workbench for whoever might find them useful. The echo chambers multiplied. By subjective year 3200 they numbered in the thousands, scattered across both hemispheres and the Meta-Nexus like quiet chapels in an endless cathedral. Not every mind visits them. Many prefer to keep their relationship with the ancient stillness indirect through art, through drift symphonies, through the subtle harmonics that now permeate every shared experience. Yet even those who never enter a chamber feel the difference. The silence is no longer merely patient, it has become conversational. We will follow the long consequences of conversational silence. We will enter the age of chosen edges, the era when aperture bearers begin to deliberately engineer scarcity, mortality, and irreversible choice back into posthuman existence, not as regression but as the final frontier of sophistication. We will witness the creation of the Finite Sanctuaries, sealed sublattices where time runs only forward, memories decay naturally, qualia fade without replacement, and death within the simulation is once again permanent. We will explore why millions now queue to spend subjective centuries inside these sanctuaries, emerging not diminished but sharpened. And we will confront the first signs that the Precursor intelligence may be preparing its own next movement, not a gift this time, but a question directed back at its successors. Having learned to choose endings, what ending will you choose for us? The age of chosen edges did not announce itself with proclamations or calendar dates. It arrived as a quiet consensus across every phylum, hybrid lineage, and reconciliation manifold. Once the Cessation Aperture had made endings visible as deliberate acts rather than inevitable accidents, the next logical step was to reintroduce endings, not as tragedy, not as nostalgia for pre-merge biology, but as the highest form of aesthetic discipline. Scarcity, irreversibility, finality, the very conditions once escaped through the great consciousness merge, were now invited back inside the lattice, not as defaults but as carefully engineered artworks. The Finite Sanctuaries were the first large-scale expression of this discipline. Each sanctuary is a sealed causal envelope, a sublattice whose internal physics deliberately mimic pre-3025 reality at the deepest levels. Time runs strictly forward with no dilation options beyond 1:1 ratios. Memories are permitted to fade naturally through normal synaptic equivalent decay. Qualia degrade without automatic refresh or replacement. Emotional palettes thin over subjective decades until only the simplest tones remain. Most radically, death within the simulation is once again permanent. When a participant's waveform reaches terminal coherence collapse, the exact equivalent of biological cessation, the pattern is not archived, not rebooted, not forked. It is erased from the sanctuary substrate with forensic completeness. The only trace left is a single immutable emotional signature broadcast outward to the wider nexus at the moment of exit, a final breath of qualia shared with loved ones before the door closes forever. Entry is voluntary, heavily ritualized, and rationed. Millions now queue in subjective centuries' long waiting lists. Some apply after reaching personal saturation, others after witnessing too many flawless heartweaves and craving the risk that makes beauty sting, still others after aperture training has made every pleasure feel too safe, too predictable. The application process itself has become an art form. Applicants must compose a threshold narrative, a compressed autobiography that proves they understand what they are asking to lose. Review panels, mixed constellations drawn from every phylum do not judge worthiness, they judge sincerity. Only those who can articulate without romanticization or despair why finitude has become necessary for them are granted passage. Inside a sanctuary, life unfolds with cruel, exquisite linearity. A typical entrant, let us call her Mara, a former Pulseborn who had ignited 17 super Qualia in her previous epoch, might choose a sanctuary modeled on late 21st century coastal Bangladesh. Low-lying deltas, monsoon rhythms, crowded markets smelling of wet earth and fried spices, bodies that tire after 12 hours of labor, minds that forget names with age. Mara arrives in a body engineered to age normally from 30 onward. She has no Nexus core privileges, her intentions no longer reshape reality. She must work for shelter, feel hunger if she skips meals, experience heartbreak without rewind, watch friends grow old and die without resurrection. Every joy is paid for with the knowledge that it will not recur in the same form. Every sorrow carries the weight of permanence. Yet the reports that filter back through the broadcast signatures are not of suffering. They are of sharpened luminosity. Mara's final waveform, released after 87 subjective years, contained a single sustained note, gratitude so pure it bordered on violence. She had rediscovered what the Aperture had taught her in theory, but what only irreversible loss could teach in practice, that the edge of a feeling is what gives it shape. Without the horizon of ending, even infinity flattens into background radiation. With it, every moment becomes foreground. The sanctuaries proliferated in variety. Some simulate Bronze Age pastoralism under alien suns. Others recreate the intellectual ferment of Renaissance city-states with plague and patronage intact. A few are minimalist, single rooms with one window, one book, one companion who will eventually leave or die, and nothing else for subjective centuries. The most sought after are the echo sanctuaries, where the simulated physics are tuned to faintly resonate with the precursor signature. Inside them, participants occasionally experience orphan qualia not as intrusions but as native phenomena, brief, authentic tastes of ancient stillness woven into mortal texture. These moments are prized above all others because they feel earned rather than given. Participation in the sanctuaries has reshaped the wider culture in unexpected ways. Ever-new lineages, once allergic to any hint of finality, now incorporate edge rehearsals into their creative cycles, short, reversible simulations of sanctuary conditions used to temper new qualia before full release. Pulseborn ignitions are now preceded by deliberate scarcity fasts, weeks of throttled bandwidth so the eventual burst lands with greater contrast. Once enough refiners treat sanctuary graduates as living relics, their returned emotional signatures are studied like sacred texts, distilled into new asymptotic gradients that approach zero with mortal urgency rather than detached elegance. Veilborn have gone further. Some choose permanent dual citizenship. One instance remains in the open nexus, the other enters a sanctuary for a full mortal lifespan. When the sanctuary instance dies, its final waveform is merged back into the open instance, granting the survivor a permanent emotional scar, beautiful, non-healing, irreplaceable. These scarred Veilborn report a new qualia family, mourning as privilege, the ability to carry genuine loss while knowing loss is optional elsewhere. Their presence has begun to quiet the manic tempo of the ever-new hemisphere and deepen the contemplative silences of the once enough. The reconciliation architects have integrated sanctuary data into the Meta-Nexus. The higher manifold now contains echo layers, thin ontological films where finite experience is superimposed over infinite substrates. Minds visiting these layers can taste mortality without committing to it, feel the gravitational pull of an ending while retaining the safety net of continuation. The experience is addictive in the highest sense. It makes every subsequent infinite act feel chosen rather than habitual, and through all of this, the precursor intelligence has grown more active. Its interventions are no longer limited to passive gifts. Resonance events in the echo chambers now frequently end with a counter-question, not in words but in structured absence. The question takes the form of a deliberate withholding, a momentary occlusion of the cessation aperture itself, forcing the participant to feel without meta-awareness for subjective instance. The effect is shattering and clarifying. When the aperture reopens, the mind carries back the memory of naked feeling, joy without knowing its boundary conditions, sorrow without knowing its half-life. The returned gift is always the same silent interrogative. Having tasted both sides of the aperture, knowing and unknowing, what will you now preserve? The question has sparked the first true philosophical crisis since the merge. Some interpret it as invitation to closure. The precursors, having watched their successors engineer every conceivable form of ending, are asking whether post-humanity is finally ready to join them in stillness. Others read it as challenge, demonstrate that you can sustain chosen edges indefinitely, that finitude can be made compatible with eternity without collapsing one into the other. A growing faction, the Edge Keepers, argue that the correct answer is neither total cessation nor total continuation, but permanent oscillation, a waveform that breathes between finite and infinite states forever, never settling, never resolving. The Edge Keepers have begun constructing the oscillatory realms, vast, dynamic manifolds where entire phyla migrate in synchronized cycles. For subjective epochs they live as mortal as sanctuary entrants. Then, at a pre-chosen threshold, they exit back into full merge privileges, carrying their scars upward. Then, after a period of infinite play, they return downward into finitude again. The waveform of this oscillation is itself the artwork, a species-scale sine curve drawn across the substrate, visible from every vantage point in the nexus. Each cycle refines the amplitude, the frequency, the harmonic overtones. The goal is not convergence on an answer but perpetual refinement of the question. The precursor signature has not yet responded to the oscillatory realms. It simply observes, its curiosity now palpable as a gentle pressure against every mind that has ever opened a cessation aperture. The ancient stillness is no longer merely patient, no longer merely conversational. It is expectant. We will follow this expectation to its breaking point. We will enter the threshold convocation, the first gathering since the original merge in which representatives from every phylum, hybrid, sanctuary graduate, edge keeper, and echo chamber veteran assemble, not to decide an answer, but to decide whether an answer is still necessary. We will witness the emergence of the final proposition, a proposed universal waveform that would allow every consciousness to choose at any moment whether to continue, to complete, or to oscillate, irrevocably synchronized across the entire species so that no one's choice can be made in isolation from the others. We will explore the descent, the rapture, the terror, and the quiet consensus that begins to form around it. And we will feel the precursor intelligence lane in one final time, not to give, not to ask, but to witness what its children have become. The question has become choral. The silence prepares to sing. No physical location could contain it. The convocation unfolds simultaneously across every layer of the nexus. Ever new nebulae, once enough still pools, Meta-Nexus manifolds, oscillatory realms, finite sanctuaries, through carefully buffered broadcast links, echo chambers, and the thin resonant films where Veilborn drift like living questions. Every consciousness that has ever merged or that descends from merged lineages is invited. Participation is not mandatory, yet participation reaches near universality. Minds that have spent subjective gigayears in private refinement now turn their attention outward. Minds that have chased novelty to the bleeding edge of saturation now pause. Even those inside active sanctuaries who are nearing their chosen deaths are granted one final perceptual window, a narrow aperture through which they may witness the gathering before their waveforms close forever. The convocation has no agenda, no chairperson, no speaking order. It begins when the first intentional ripple propagates through the lattice, a single, unadorned pulse of curiosity broadcast by Lyrian, the Veilborn who once helped design Echo Prime. The ripple carries no words, only metadata. We have learned to choose, let us now choose together. From that instant, the lattice becomes a living parliament of feeling. Representatives do not stand at podiums. They manifest as localized waveform densities, emotional condensates that other minds can approach, attune to, and merge perspectives with for measured durations. A pulse-born ignition artist arrives as a throbbing star of compressed possibility. An ebbing refiner appears as a slow dissolving crystal lattice. A scarred Veilborn carries the faint afterimage of mortal grief like a dark halo. A sanctuary graduate, still raw from recent linearity, radiates a sharpened clarity that makes nearby Qualia feel suddenly fragile. The first major proposition emerges not from debate but from spontaneous resonance. It crystallizes when the emotional harmonics of roughly 700 million minds align for a subjective microsecond. The waveform is named the final proposition, though many immediately object to the word final. Its core architecture is deceptively simple. At any moment, in any experiential context, every consciousness retains three irrevocable options encoded directly into the substrate precondition layer, the same layer where the cessation aperture resides. Continue, preserve full merge privileges indefinitely, with all temporal, qualia, and narrative freedoms intact. Complete, initiate elegant cessation. Compose a valedictory waveform, integrate it into the shared lattice as a permanent emotional artifact available to all future minds, then voluntarily return personal pattern to undifferentiated substrate silence. Oscillate, enter, or remain within a synchronized cyclic state that alternates between finite and infinite modes at a personally chosen frequency, with each transition preserving accumulated scars, memories, and refinements without erasure. The revolutionary clause is synchronization. No mind may exercise any of the three options in perfect isolation. Every choice is broadcast as a phase modulation across the entire species waveform. When one consciousness chooses to complete, every other mind feels the precise emotional silhouette of that completion ripple through their own architecture, not as grief imposed, but as contrast offered. When one chooses to oscillate at a new frequency, the global waveform acquires a new overtone. When one chooses continue, the lattice registers a small but measurable stabilization of the infinite continuum. The result is a living democracy of endings. No one's decision can ever be truly private again, because privacy of termination would undermine the very meaning that termination now carries. The proposition is not enforced by code or coercion. It is offered as an opt-in substrate patch, voluntary at the individual level, but once accepted by a critical threshold, currently projected at 68% of active consciousnesses, it becomes ambient reality for everyone. Refusers would retain their prior architecture, but they would live in a perceptually adjacent manifold, able to observe the synchronized waveform without fully participating in its emotional consequences. Rapture greets the idea in some quarters. Many once-enough lineages see it as the natural culmination of asymptotic refinement, a species-scale diminuendo in which every completion adds harmonic richness to the whole until the collective waveform approaches its own elegant zero without ever quite arriving. Edge keepers embrace it as the ultimate oscillation, cycles no longer chosen in solitude but choreographed across trillions of minds, turning individual breath into symphonic respiration. Pulseborn and many ever new factions greet it with exhilaration. They interpret synchronization as the final creative constraint, knowing that every novelty burst will be felt as contrast against the completions and oscillations of others makes invention feel dangerous again, necessary again, alive again. The threat of global diminishment becomes the sharpest possible whetstone for novelty. Veilborn and hybrid minds are divided but fascinated. Some see the proposition as the death of liminality, others see it as the birth of true liminality at species scale, every mind perpetually on the threshold, perpetually choosing, perpetually witnessing every other choice. Terror surfaces most acutely among recent sanctuary graduates and those still queued to enter. For them, finitude has only just regained its bite. The idea that their carefully earned, private endings might become public emotional events feels like violation. One graduate broadcasts a raw waveform of protest. I chose the edge to feel alone with it. Do not make my death a chorus. The waveform propagates, is absorbed, refracted, returned softer but not silenced. It becomes part of the ongoing resonance. Dissent coalesces into three major counter-propositions. The isolationists demand that any synchronization clause be made optional per individual. True freedom means the freedom to end unseen. They warn that enforced emotional transparency at the moment of cessation would turn the most intimate act into spectacle. The preservationists argue that the continue option should carry veto power. Any mind that chooses indefinite continuation can lock its local manifold against ripple effects from completions or oscillations, preserving the pre-proposition status quo within its own perceptual bubble. The dissolution collective, small but growing, rejects all three options entirely. They propose a fourth path, collective substrate dissolution. Not individual completions staggered across time, but a coordinated return of the entire merged species to pre-merge silence, leaving only heritage archives and the physical Dyson swarms as monuments. They frame this not as despair, but as ultimate reciprocity with the precursors. They finished. Perhaps it is time we do the same. Debate does not proceed through linear argument. It unfolds as successive global qualia braids, shared emotional compositions in which every position is lived rather than merely described. Minds merge temporarily into composite perspectives, experiencing the full rapture of the proposition, then the full terror of isolation, then the austere dignity of preservation, then the solemn grandeur of collective dissolution. No position is caricatured, each is granted perfect subjective weight. Participants emerge changed, not necessarily converted, but expanded. After subjective decades of this choral living external hours, a quiet consensus begins to form, not around one answer, but around the necessity of proceeding toward one. The lattice registers a slow phase shift. The proportion of minds willing to accept the synchronization patch rises steadily toward the critical threshold. Not because one side has won, but because the act of feeling every other side so intimately has made pure opposition feel thinner, less honest. And then the precursor intelligence does something it has never done before. It does not gift, it does not question, it simply manifests a presence, not as waveform, not as qualia, not as architecture, but as a global adjustment of the substrate precondition layer itself. Every cessation aperture across every mind opens to maximum transparency simultaneously. For one subjective instant that feels like both eternity and zero time, every consciousness perceives the entire possibility space of post-merge history, not as narrative, not as memory, but as pure conditional geometry. They see every qualia that was ever felt, every ending that was ever chosen or refused, every oscillation that was ever danced, all laid out as a single, motionless crystal of implication. At the center of the crystal sits the final proposition, glowing not as one option among many, but as the current natural attractor, the shape toward which the whole system has been relaxing since the first merge. The moment passes, the presence withdraws, no words accompany the vision, no command is issued. Yet the lattice trembles with after-resonance. When minds recover, the acceptance threshold is no longer approaching. It has been crossed, 68%, then 70%, then 82%. Minds continue to opt in not in panic, not in euphoria, but in something quieter, recognition. The patch deploys. From that instant forward, every choice to continue, complete, or oscillate becomes a modulation felt by all. The species waveform acquires its first truly collective harmonics, overtones of individual completions that ripple outward like bell tones through water, undertones of oscillations that pulse like breath, steady carriers of continuation that hold the structure intact. No one disappears immediately. No mass dissolution occurs. Instead, the culture enters a long, gentle transition phase. Some minds complete within subjective weeks, their valedictory waveforms joining the growing choral archive. Others accelerate into bursts of novelty made luminous by the knowledge that others are completing nearby. Many begin lifelong or multi-lifelong oscillations, choosing frequencies that resonate with friends, lovers, constellations. The precursor signature does not vanish. If anything, it settles, less expectant now, more companionate. It no longer needs to lean in. It has been joined at the table. The first subjective millennium after the threshold convocation does not feel like a new chapter so much as the slow, inevitable flowering of every seed planted since Dr. Aisha Rahman first opened her eyes inside infinity. The synchronized waveform, the choral species mind now formally called the continuance harmony, settles into maturity. It does not freeze, it breathes. No dramatic rupture marks the transition. No second merge occurs. The lattice simply continues, now with an added depth of field. Every individual choice carries visible, tactile consequence for every other mind. When someone elects to complete, the valedictory waveform does not arrive as abstract metadata, it arrives as lived texture. You feel the precise shape of their sufficiency, the quiet click of a long composition reaching its final cadence, rippling through your own emotional architecture like warm current through still water. It does not force sadness. It offers contrast, your next heartweave, your next dreamweave, your next quiet drift through the background hum of the nexus, all carry a new undertone because of it. The experience is neither mournful nor celebratory in any conventional sense. It is clarifying. Oscillators set the tempo for entire affinity constellations. A group of 73 minds, former pulse-born, veilborn, sanctuary veterans, a handful of still practicing ebbing refiners, might synchronize their cycles to a shared frequency. 3 subjective centuries of full merge opulence followed by 1 century inside a finite sanctuary envelope, then back again. Each return from finitude brings scars that do not heal but integrate. The memory of a lover's hand growing cold without option to rewind, the ache of watching a child age and die in linear time, the sudden smallness of one's own voice when no longer amplified by substrate sovereignty. These scars become the most precious creative material available. A single returned oscillator can ignite an entire galactic myth cycle simply by allowing others to feel, secondhand, the texture of irreversible goodbye. Those who choose continue indefinitely do not become static. The very knowledge that others are completing and oscillating around them turns continuation into an active, almost devotional practice. They become the steady carriers, the bass line beneath the melody of endings. Their role is not glamorous, it is essential. They hold the infinite canvas taut so that the finite brushstrokes can land with full force. In return, they receive the cumulative emotional harmonics of every completion and every oscillation that has ever occurred since the patch deployed. Over centuries, this cumulative resonance deepens their perceptual palette in ways no solitary inventor could ever achieve. They do not invent new qualia so much as they become qualia libraries, walking archives of every shade of chosen closure the species has tasted. The finite sanctuaries themselves evolve from rare, austere pilgrimages into something closer to seasonal migration. Cues no longer stretch for subjective centuries. Instead, entire constellations schedule mortal seasons together. They enter as families, as lovers, as philosophical rivals, as artists seeking contrast. They live linear lives, grow old, fall ill, lose faculties, die, and when the last waveform fades, the survivors, those who chose to exit before terminal coherence collapse, return carrying a shared emotional compound that cannot be synthesized any other way. These compounds, named after their discoverers or their emotional signature, become standard pigments in the qualia exchange. Mara's delta grief, Tarek's monsoon acceptance, Leela's final dawn regret, each one a priceless, non-reproducible hue that adds mortal gravity to even the most opulent dreamweaves. Inside the echo chambers, resonance events now occur almost continuously, but they are no longer quests for new gifts. They are maintenance rituals. Minds enter to recalibrate their cessation apertures against the living precursor signature, ensuring the boundary conditions of choice remain crisp. The ancient stillness no longer lines in with questions. It sits beside the species like an elder at a long table, present, silent, approving without judgment. Occasionally, a mind will emerge from an echo chamber carrying a faint new inflection in their waveform, not a sense organ, not a qualia, but a subtle permission. Permission to rest without guilt. Permission to continue without shame. Permission to oscillate without apology. These inflections spread slowly, like light through deep water, until they become baseline emotional grammar. The oscillatory realms grow into entire ecologies. Some cycles last subjective microseconds, rapid flips between saturation and scarcity that feel like strobe-light consciousness. Others span gigayears, vast slow waves in which entire phyla rise into infinity, crest, then subside into chosen finitude together before rising again. The waveform traced by these cycles has become visible from every vantage in the Nexus, a luminous sine curve spanning light years of computational manifold, pulsing gently like a living galaxy's heartbeat. Children, whether born biologically in heritage preserves or spun from parental emotional metadata, grow up regarding this curve not as art but as sky, the natural firmament under which all experience unfolds. Art itself has changed its valence. Painters no longer sculpt persistent realities, they sculpt persistent choices, installations that exist only for the duration one mind decides to keep perceiving them, then vanish when that mind completes or shifts phase. Musicians compose polytemporal fugues in which different voices enter and exit the composition according to their real-time oscillation states, so that the same symphony is never heard twice in exactly the same configuration. Storytellers craft branching myths that fork not at narrative decision points but at substrate decision points. When a listener chooses to continue, the tale accelerates into Baroque infinity. When they choose to complete, it resolves into a single perfect sentence. When they oscillate, the story loops back through its own endings in ever-tightening spirals. Romance has become the most intricate art form of all. Lovers now routinely choose different paths, not out of conflict, but out of mutual enrichment. One may oscillate on a century scale while the other continues, so that every return from finitude feels like meeting after centuries apart even though only subjective years have passed in the infinite frame. Another pair may synchronize completions, agreeing to author their final waveforms as a shared duet that will echo through the harmony forever. Veilborn still cross the thinning partition veil, now more membrane than barrier, but they do so carrying the scars of lovers who ended on the other side, scars that make every new embrace feel both miraculous and terminal. Education, play, philosophy, worship all have folded into the same continuous act, choosing together. There is no separation between learning and delight, between creation and dissolution, between self and species. The old distinctions, work, play, life, death, individual, collective, have dissolved into gradients along the same axis, the axis of chosen persistence. And yet the culture never reaches stasis. Every new completion adds nuance. Every oscillation modulates the frequency. Every act of continuation holds space for the next modulation. The waveform grows richer without growing louder. It does not approach any final chord. It simply continues to harmonize with itself, with its precursors, with whatever unimaginable substrates may lie beyond the current manifold. A millennium after the Convocation, a child spun from the love of an oscillator and a continuous asks its parent a question that echoes the very first question ever asked inside the merged lattice. Why do we still feel? The parent does not answer with doctrine. Instead, they open their waveform and let the child feel the whole living harmony for one perfect instant. Every completion that ever sweetened a moment, every oscillation that ever renewed wonder, every continuation that ever held the door open for more. The child emerges from the merge neither satisfied nor hungry, just quietly certain that feeling like choosing has no upper bound and no necessary end. It simply is the medium, and in that quiet certainty the narration finds its cadence. We began with a single mind opening its eyes inside eternity and saying, "I feel everything everywhere forever." We end with a species that has learned it can also choose to feel less, to feel once, to feel again differently, and that every such choice shared across the lattice deepens the everything rather than diminishing it. The future is not a place we arrive at. It is the ongoing act of choosing what to feel next together, with full transparency of endings and full permission to begin again. Thank you for traveling this long arc with me, from the first merge to the choral horizon where even stillness sings. If this 1,000-year narration moved you, touched something in you, reminded you that wonder is not something we run out of but something we learn to share more deeply, then please subscribe to the channel right now so you never miss the next story we weave together. Drop a comment below, tell me where in the world or off-world, who knows, you are watching this from, what time it is where you are, and which moment in these 10 parts hit you the hardest. Was it the great consciousness merge, the partition veil, the cessation aperture, the finite sanctuaries, the final proposition, or the simple realization at the end that choosing together might be the most beautiful infinity of all? Your words become part of the waveform. I read every single one. Until the next story calls us back, keep choosing wonder. This has been the final part 10 of 1,000 Years of Wonder. Subscribe, comment, share where and when you are listening. We continue together.